Hi everyone, welcome back to Be Like Christ. Today we are talking about 1 Kings chapter 8. We've got 66 verses to cover, so we better be fast. Our PDF is available on our website at tobelikechrist.com. When these events happen? Well, we're talking about the reign of King Solomon, which lasted about 40 years. 1 Kings 8 records events that happened in the middle years of Solomon's reign. The temple that we've been talking about was completed in Solomon's 11th year. In terms of our key historical characters, we have Solomon, the third king over Israel and Judah, and then elders and officials. Solomon gathered all of the elders, the heads of the tribes, and the leaders of the fathers' houses in Jerusalem for the temple dedication when it was completed. And then our map, of course, if you've been tracking with us for the last couple chapters, you'll know that the temple was in the city of Jerusalem. All right, in our 66-verse chapter, our first section is verses 1 through 11. The Ark of the Covenant is finally brought into the completed temple. So Solomon assembled all of the leaders of Israel in Jerusalem to celebrate this event, the Ark being brought into the temple for the very first time. We're told that Solomon and the Israelites offered so many sacrifices that they couldn't even be numbered, which must have been massive because you'll see at the end of the chapter, there is a counting of sacrifices and it is huge. So this may have been even bigger than that one. The priests then carried the ark into the most holy place, into that interior room of the temple, underneath the outstretched wings of the cherubim, which were those heavenly beings that we talked about in chapter 6. When the ark was in place, God's glory in the form of a cloud filled the temple. So it's kind of God's acknowledgement that he approved of this. Much of the rest of the chapter is going to be a record of what Solomon said on this day of dedication. So verses 12 through 21, Solomon rehearses the events that brought about the temple. So Solomon recognized that this cloud was a sign of God's approval. He blessed God in front of all of the people, and he spoke very fondly about his father, David's desire to build this temple. Solomon worshiped God for keeping his promises to David. While David wasn't allowed to build the temple himself, God permitted his son to inherit his throne, which was one of God's promises, and to build the temple, which was another of his promises. So now, the biggest chunk of the chapter, and probably the most famous, verses 22 through 53, Solomon's prayer to God at the dedication of the temple. So Solomon stood in front of the altar of burnt offering, which was out in front of the temple, and he prayed to God with outstretched hands. He asked God for several things. He asked God to fulfill his promises and to bless Judah and Israel so long as their kings would follow the Lord and keep his statutes and keep his commands. Solomon also acknowledged that although the temple was, in his words, an exalted house, it was a magnificent structure, it was by no means worthy of containing the presence of the King of the universe and the creator of the entire universe. Nonetheless, Solomon asked the Lord to hear the prayers of the people that were offered at that place, at the temple, and towards the temple. He also prayed, interestingly, that God would hear the prayers of foreigners who came to the temple seeking to know the true God of heaven. Now, a large portion of Solomon's prayer has to do with future forgiveness. He asked God to be open to forgiving the nation if in the future sometime they fell into sin. He specifically asked that they be allowed to return to the promised land if they repented after being taken captive and exiled by a foreign power. Now, if you know the history of Judah, you'll know that that prayer definitely seems to be somewhat prophetic. They would need that prayer in the future. Now we need to talk about Solomon's blessing and prayer over his people, verses 54 through 61. So Solomon then turned, after he prayed to God, turned to his assembly, this assembly of people that had gathered there, and he praised God for keeping all the promises that he had made to Moses, bringing the people out of Egypt, bringing them to this promised land, eventually bringing Solomon to the throne. He said, quote, "The Lord our God be with us, may he not leave us or forsake us," verse 57. Solomon's aim was for all of the nations of the world to know the identity of the true God through his people, Israel. Now, for this to happen, God's people needed to uphold his commandments and his statutes. We'll see if that comes about. In verses 62 through 66, 7 days of feasting and thousands of sacrifices. Solomon offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep at the temple. Solomon and the people celebrated and had a feast for 7 days. So this was just, can you imagine sacrificing 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep? So interestingly, I don't have an application for this section, but if you for this chapter because it's so long. But if you want to look up something really interesting, look up how many gallons of blood is in an ox and how many gallons of blood is in a sheep, and then do the math to figure out how much blood would have been spilled at the temple that day and the kind of container that you would need to hold all of that, like hundreds of thousands of gallons, right? And you can find pictures of like hundreds of thousands of gallon tanks, that are used like in industrial complexes and stuff like that. And what would have been required to hold that amount of blood, which I suppose this is an application, and that is that, even those hundreds of thousands of gallons of blood that were spilled that day, ultimately, well, and what would be spilled, the hundreds of thousands, millions of gallons of blood that would be spilled in the future, ultimately those weren't enough, those weren't sufficient to do what Jesus did with his one death and his especially precious blood on the cross. So that's the story that we're endeavoring on and through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. So hope you enjoyed our study today. If you're queasy, don't do the blood calculation. But Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow for 1 Kings chapter 9.